Okay, I've got 6 o'clock, a little after, watching guests populating into the site. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 10th and final Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2021 to 2022 academic year, which is a look at the Halsey Alpha Advanced Research Program and faculty-led student research programs that benefit students, the college, and the United States Navy. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our speaker series. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and sponsors, as well as my hardworking staff for their incredible and tireless support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our very generous foundation members, including many of you, the U.S. Naval War College has continued its innovative cutting-edge education and research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its mission to deliver excellence in education and research, and remains committed to providing critical resources needed to advance its priorities of research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowed chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional international studies. Tonight's presentation is an example of the scholarly work U.S. Naval War College students are immersed in during their 10-month academic year at the college, sometimes a little longer, whose mission it is to educate and develop future military and civilian leaders of our nation and the world, including the following notable flag officers and distinguished civilian executives. Admiral Scott Swift, United States Navy retired former commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Mike Rogers, U.S. Navy retired former commander, U.S. Cyber Command, and director of National Security Agency. General David Rodriguez, U.S. Army retired former commander, U.S. Africa Command. Dr. Clifford Stanley, Major General, United States Marine Corps retired, Undersecretary of Defense, Personnel and Readiness, and Admiral Robert Papp Jr., U.S. Coast Guard, former Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. As a matter of protocol, should you have a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. We plan to address as many of your questions as time permits. For 2 years now, we've been bringing Newport Lecture Series presentations and many other events hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. While we have begun, thankfully, to host in-person events again here locally in Newport and in such cities recently as Mobile, Alabama, and Redwood City, California, we plan to continue to present the majority of these lectures virtually to benefit our members and friends around the globe. We do hope to see you again in person on the college campus or Naval Station Newport or other venue nationally when possible. Now to introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation. Professor James Fitzsimons is the director of the Halsey Alpha Advanced Research Group in the college's Strategic and Operational Research Department. His work centers on analysis of military issues in the Asia-Pacific region, including warfighting balances and modernization trends. Professor Fitzsimons served for 27 years in the United States Navy as both a surface line officer and intelligence officer, retiring in 2001 at the rank of captain. His operational assignments included USS Blakely, FF-1072, USS Enterprise, CVN-65, and the USS America CV-66 Carrier Strike Group. His ashore assignments included tours with the Chief of Naval Operations Current Intelligence Division, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations and Naval Warfare Directorate, the Navy Operational Intelligence Center Detachment Newport, the Chief of Naval Operations Strategic Studies Group, and the Net Assessment Directorate of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Professor Fitzsimons has been at the U.S. Naval War College since 2003 and holds a Master of Science degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Bachelor of Science degree from the United States Naval Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Professor Jim Fitzsimons.
Thank you, George. What I'm going to do now is share my screen so I can call my slides up here. Here we go. As George said, let me get back to, there we go. I'm the director of the Halsey Alpha Advanced Research Project here at the Naval War College, and I've been in this role since 2003. That's 19 years. The advanced research program had a fairly unusual genesis. I got to the college on active duty in 1997, retired in 2001. was hired on the research side, that's the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, and was given an opportunity with my colleague, Dr. Craig Kerner, to try and come up with a research activity that would be of future value to the Navy. And an awful lot of what we were doing was, I think, influenced by a tour I had at the Directorate of Net Assessment in OSD in the 1990s, serving under then Mr. Andrew Marshall. We were looking at the future of warfare. And he had two overriding beliefs, which he felt should be assumptions going forward in the future. The first one was that it is always premature to assume that you are without a competition. And we're in the post-Cold War era. The Soviet Union had disappeared. There was a real tendency in the US Navy to declare major competition over and sea and air control globally as the sole purview of the United States, not only in the near term, but possibly in perpetuity. Mr. Marshall's view, and I came to believe this view, is that we should never assume that someone is not waiting in the wings in order to challenge us at the high end of the conflict spectrum. It was very difficult back then to assume that there could be any country that could challenge the United States in its core competencies, particularly after Desert Storm, where the US military with its allies rolled over a very competent military in Iraq in just a few weeks, and in a ground campaign that lasted barely 100 hours. But there were other people who were watching this, and one of them was China. And I think China was very much concerned by what happened to the Soviet Union, a former superpower that was dismembered against its will and became a relatively minor power in the world, albeit one still armed with nuclear weapons. The second lesson that I drew from Mr. Marshall was that one should always assume that warfare is evolving, and that history tells us that the character of warfare can undergo very radical change fairly rapidly. And we should be particularly concerned with long periods of peace between major conflicts, with the accumulation of technology that is used in innovative ways such that it redefines the force balances on the battlefield and renders obsolete the former dominant attributes of warfare. And so going forward, looking forward from the 1990s, his view was we had about 20 years or so to get this right, to expect major competition to emerge and to expect that warfare would look very, very different from everything that we had planned for, including Desert Storm. And so that was really the theoretical genesis of the Halsey Alpha group. Dr. Kerner and I decided that we would start a small research program in order to explore these two issues. Number one, if the United States had a peer or near peer competitor in the near term, who would that be? How would this war develop? What would it look like? How would we be challenged on a modern battlefield at the high end of the conflict spectrum? And the second one was whether or not the character of warfare was undergoing radical change to the extent that most of our assumptions about what would matter on the future battlefield were wrong, and that an awful lot of the programs that the United States was investing in would be rendered obsolete. We started bringing students over from the academic side because we really wanted to understand what warfare was like to those currently serving in the fleet and field. I had been out of a fleet job for 10 years at that point. My colleague, Dr. Kerner, had no military experience. He was a PhD economist from the University of Chicago, which had proven very valuable to us in our research effort. But we began to rely more and more on students that we pulled out of the core curriculum for short periods of time to inform us as to what was happening out there in the real world. And a very, I think, forward-looking administration at the War College at the time said, why don't we set up an experimental group in which we actually give you a dozen students and you can have them for part of the academic year as part of their in-residence program and see what you can come up with. And that was really the initiation of the first advanced research project. And the intent was twofold: to provide these officers the best education we could into modern military operations. But the second one was to do focused research and analysis that would be of value to the operating forces and the acquisition community. Identify real problems, real solutions, and come up with real solid recommendations. Now, what this evolved into was an integration between academics and research. And for those of you who are familiar with the War College, you know there's an academic side in which we have all of our in-residence students, as well as a distance education program, which is quite extensive. And then we have a research side, the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, which occupies McCarty-Little Hall, the blue roofed building up on the hill. And in McCarty-Little Hall, in the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, we have the Wargaming Department, we have the Stockton International Law Department, we have the China Maritime Studies Institute, and we also have our advanced research programs. So this is a real melding, the ARP process, a real melding of academics and research, which really didn't exist before 2003, and now has taken on something of a life of its own. And I think it replicates an awful lot of the research activities that go on at a civilian research university, where having collaborative teams between faculty and students to address real world problems and challenges is part and parcel of the graduate education program. So this is what we have created at the Naval War College. We currently have 3 regional advanced research programs. My group, Halsey Alpha, which is the oldest. It started in 2003. We originally were not a China group. Originally, our focus was solely on the prospects of a peer or near peer competitor and what that would mean for the US Joint Forces, as well as the changing character of warfare. But early on, we were looking for a set of maritime air challenges that could be posed by a country within the next 5 to 10 years that were very compelling. And we simply decided at that point, we would look at China as a country who had aspirations for regional military power, possibly global military power, and was investing very, very heavily in advanced technologies. We always held out the prospect, I think over the next decade, that we might change our focus from China to some other country, and Russia was second on our list. But China continued to develop so fast, so radically, with so much power. And the prospects for some type of an altercation continued to increase, such that we just kept our focus on China, and it has never left China. So we have become the de facto China warfighting group. We were called the Halsey Alpha Group as a name generated by the then provost back in 2003 for a couple of reasons. One, we were not a China group at that time. And number 2, because we were not allowed to say in an unclassified environment that we were looking at the prospect of a conflict with China. It was considered very sensitive. And it's only been in the last 5 or 6 years that not only have we been allowed to say that openly, but we have embraced that, because the United States government and the US military has called China the pacing threat that provides us with our greatest challenge. So Halsey Alpha is the China group. In 2006, a decision was made to spin part of the Halsey Alpha group off to look at the Middle East and Iran. And that became the Halsey Bravo group. And then in the last few years, we had a 3rd regional group that was spun out of Halsey Alpha, and that's now called the Holloway group, and they look at Europe and Russia. So those are the 3 regional groups that compose our advanced research program. The team composition for the 3 groups is pretty much identical. And this was largely established when we started the groups back in 2003. It wasn't clear how big the group should be. It wasn't clear what the makeup of the group should be. We did a lot of experimentation in the early years, looking at different mixes of individuals, both faculty and students. But over a period of 3 or 4 early years, we kind of settled on a model which has served us very well for the past 2 decades. So the current Halsey Alpha group has 4 dedicated faculty contractors. We have 3 faculty, 1 contractor. The other groups generally have 3 faculty. And each group generally has about 15 students who are pulled out of the core curriculum for part of their in-residence program. And all of the groups are joint. We determined early on it was absolutely necessary in this modern age, looking at modern combat operations, that we had to have a completely joint group. So typically 2/3 of our group is Navy. We generally have 1 to 2 Marines. We've always had 2 to 3 Air Force. Army we didn't have for about the first 15 years, and for a variety of reasons, the Army began to get very important for us. Early on, we wanted Army engineers for a project that we were doing. But in the last couple of years, now that the Army has embraced long-range precision strike weapons, particularly ones which have an anti-ship role, like Maritime Strike Tomahawk and Prism, they've become very relevant, not only to maritime operations, but to our group. And so we have always had an Army officer now for several years. And finally, we occasionally have a civilian, and it's generally an engineer who's pulled out of the research community, who is both trying to impart some sense of engineering background to what we're doing, but also trying to better understand the context of the challenges that they are producing capabilities for. It's very important for us to have a broad range of backgrounds, not only among the services, but within the services. So we recruit officers based upon what their specialty is. So among the 2/3 of the Navy officers that we have, we're always looking for generally 2 submariners, 2 tactical aviators, an intelligence officer, sometimes a supply officer. We'll have a couple of surface officers. Likewise, in the Air Force, we're looking for a fighter pilot, someone who has bomber experience, someone who has space experience. The whole idea is to get this mix. And although we're fairly limited in the number of students that we can take at any given time, we look at a different mix every time we recruit students so that we can continue to feed that into the problems that we're working on. One of the most interesting aspects that we really hadn't anticipated from this program is that most of the learning that our students seem to get out of this effort, they get from fellow team members. And I typically ask a student at the end of their academic program, what was the most valuable experience you had out of participation in Halsey Alpha? And they almost always say, it was my opportunity as, let's say, a surface warfare officer to sit next to an F-22 pilot looking at a common problem for a period of 9 to 15 months and really picking their brain on how the Air Force works and how Air Force TAC Air works. That it's an invaluable experience that they don't really get anywhere else. And so this is the program that we have in Halsey Alpha. And you can see the picture there. That's the Halsey Alpha team from spring 2022. At the end of the year, we always take a team photo. And you can see the faculty members in the front on the left and right, and those in the middle are were our team students for this year. Now, when we started the Halsey Alpha program in 2003, we were largely given carte blanche as to how you run this. The intent of the leadership was that we provide an educational experience, and that we also have a program which would generate insights and recommendations for the operating forces that they would find relevant. And so we had many, many options here. It could have been a seminar lecture program, although you really don't get much of visceral experience of solving a problem through sitting seminars and lectures for a year. So we decided we would run a war game at the end of 2003. And that was our first game. We divided our team up into a red, blue, and control group. Red represented China, blue was the US, and our control group did the assessments. Faculty served as higher authority, so we would provide the strategic context, and we would provide input at the higher operational and strategic level as those issues came up. We would also provide the overall direction of the game to make sure it stayed focused so that we were actually achieving the objectives that we had set out. That initial game proved to be so insightful that we said, let us apply the lessons learned from that game to a follow-on game and replay the scenario. And we said after that second game, well, this was a very insightful effort. So let's take the lessons we learned from that game and apply it to the next game in the series. And so what we ended up doing is playing game after game after game and applying the lessons from one game to the next. And we have been gaming continuously since 2004 now. We've never had a period where there's not a game ongoing. Now, our games are a little bit unique. First of all, they are very realistic scenarios. It's up to the faculty to define the road to conflict, but we try to base it as much in fact as possible. We are not predicting war, in our case, with China, but it has to be a plausible path that takes you to conflict with plausible strategic aims and plausible operational objectives for both sides. We typically set our games and our analysis 2 years in the future. And the reason we do that is to make the experience as relevant as possible to our student practitioners, but also make it as relevant as possible to the operating forces who proven to be avid consumers of our output and are very interested in our insights and recommendations about what they should do with what they have in the near term. So we seldom deal with really advanced systems that are not going to appear in the near term. It is a fairly near-term focus. Another unique aspect of our games is the length. Typically, a game of ours lasts 10 weeks. We have found that you really have to delve into the assessment process for each move. You cannot gloss that over. The devil is in the details. And when you're interested in strategic outcomes, you have to look at operational outcomes. And if you have operational outcomes, you have to delve into the tactics. And so we're playing an operational level game under strategic context, but we are playing it and assessing it at a tactical level. And when you do that, it takes generally a week to assess a single move that might have only taken 6 hours of game time. When we started playing these games years ago, we could typically get through 3 days of combat in a week. And so we'd be looking at 30 days of combat over 10 weeks. Our process and modern warfare is now so complex, we're lucky to get through 2 days of combat in a week. We have no artificial limitation on how long these games go on. That's a real value to us because if you are familiar with a lot of the Navy's games, like the Global Series, they have to get through World War III in 3.5 days. It's got to start and it's got to finish in that time period because they're dependent upon players from the outside to come in who cannot spend more than a week at Newport. For us, all of our players are internal to our teams. So the pace of the game is driven by the pace of the assessment. And if we only get through 1 day of combat a week, so be it, if that's generating the insights and learning we want. But when we get to the end of a 10-week period, and we still think there's insights to be gleaned from that game, we can continue that game. And generally, that's one of the things we ask our players. From the position you're in now, do you still think you can achieve your objectives and do you want to continue to play? So this year, for example, we started a 10-week game last November. It terminated in March. The red team saw a lot of opportunities for expanding the conflict horizontally, and the blue team was willing to play against that expansion. And so that initiated a second 10-week game. And we have terminated now 20 weeks of play on a single scenario. But the question for our players is, do you want to go for 30 weeks? And that's something we'll decide this summer. As I said earlier, we generally play a single scenario multiple times, typically in groups of 3. So we'll play 3 games during an academic year, fall, winter, and spring, which are aligned to the trimester period. So a trimester is about 12 weeks. So we will play a 10-week game in the fall, winter, and spring. And it's generally the exact same scenario with minor modifications. But what we do is we apply the lessons from one game to the next game to the next game. And ideally by the springtime, when we conclude that 3-game series in June, we have a good stable of insights that we can take out of that we can then feed back to the acquisition folks and the operating forces. It's what we call an iterative process. So we do what we call iterative gaming, where you're constantly driving towards best red and best blue. Now, generally between years, we'll change scenarios. And for our particular group, the primary scenarios are a contingency in the East China Sea, one in the South China Sea, and Taiwan. And I'd say half the games we've played in Taiwan scenarios in the past 19 years. We also have a unique aspect on our games in that we have a rolling student accession. In other words, we recruit 5 students to replace 5 graduates each term. So there's generally 10 carryovers from game to game and 5 new students. We also mix up the students on the teams. So we try to cycle our students through a red team, a blue team, and the control team during their tenure at the War College so that they can see the war from different aspects. We also give the students an awful lot of leeway in determining what the assessment factors are. So since they know they're going to be moved between teams, between games, they generally are very objective in determining assessment factors that are not going to be to their detriment in the next game if they have to switch sides. So that's another reason we do this. It's worked out very well for us. But we think it's extremely important to not only for our students to see blue, that is US operations from the US side over 3 iterations, but also to see red, a very dynamic thinking red, who is trying to do his best with the systems that he has over 3 iterations and compare red to blue. At the end of a game, we always have a big wrap up in which everything is revealed, because these games are played in the blind for each one of the groups. Red is in one set of rooms, blue is in another, and the control team ensures that each side only gets to see what they would see based on the information they can generate. And so at the end of game, we reveal all so that they can see where they were successful based on good play, or where they were successful or unsuccessful based on either good or bad luck. And that's very important for us to give them the overall picture of what happened. I just wanted to bring this up because this diagram shows how complex modern war is. Now, as I said, almost all our gaming is done at the classified level, but early on in 2020, we had to depart the Newport campus because of COVID. And so we went offline for one entire term. And it was a question of what do we do? And we decided that we could actually run an unclassified game based on unclassified information pulled off the internet that was good enough. And it would, and among other things, it would give people a good enough view of the forces, a good enough understanding of geography, and that once we could come back on campus, which we could after one term, we would go back into classified gaming. So I went back through our records and I pulled out this particular Google Earth plot that we used during that COVID hiatus. And this is an unclassified plot, but it very much looks like a classified plot that we would use in a classified game on the War College campus itself. And I think 2 things that this reveals. One is that modern warfare is incredibly complex. This does not even represent the full range of ISR capabilities or cyber, or any cyber that's injected into the war game. And it shows how complex war games are. This is why the assessment process takes so long and is so detailed. We have a control team which is constantly going through layer after layer of these plots, looking at all regimes of warfare, trying to determine the interactions, then taking those interactions into our models. And our models are used to determine the outcomes of all the interactions. And we generally build our own models based on the best empirical data that we have. But also say that for the most part, our move assessments are stochastic, meaning we actually roll the dice, given broad ranges of possibilities. A given game might have, 500 variables that have to be addressed with dice rolls for each one of them. And so our red and blue teams, who are generally our part-time students, those are taking Halsey Alpha as an elective for 2 out of 3 terms. They can probably produce a move in maybe 6 to 8 hours, but our assessment team probably works 30 to 40 hours during the week trying to adjudicate that and to determine where those interactions occurred and what the outcomes of those interactions are. It's incredibly complex, but I would also say the vast majority of the insight and learning is not from the red and blue planners, but it comes out of the assessment team, who are struggling with how you understand the modern battle space and what happens when literally hundreds of entities interact with one another in real time. So you can see how tough that is. When does a game terminate? Well, it's, as I alluded to earlier, it's somewhat variable. We have a moving clock in our games. We occasionally get to a point in our combat operations on the game floor where one side, either through a misplay or simply a series of bad dice rolls, is in a box and cannot recover. And you have a choice then. You either terminate the game and start the game over, or you reset. So it's not too uncommon for us in a game to move the clock back an hour, 6 hours, 12 hours, reset and replay from that position. The current game that we just ended, Red made a series of ill-advised moves, and we had to move the game clock back more than a couple of days to reset. We had a similar case a couple of years ago where Blue was devastated in a period of hours through just bad play and bad luck. And we had to completely reset and start that whole segment over again. We allow our students to make ill-advised moves. And part of the, I think, faculty process is to advise the students as to what looks like a good move and what looks like a not so good move. What looks very risky but worth it, or very risky but not worth it. But we generally allow the students to play the way they want to play it. And we think it's a valid part of the learning process if they make ill-advised moves and then pay a severe penalty for that. Games essentially end when there are diminishing returns and either one or both teams wants to stop playing because they don't think they can achieve their objectives. And so we're looking for a learning experience. Is there learning that's going on that would be enhanced by continuing the play? Are there further operational insights to be derived? And when the answer is no, we terminate the game, even if it's short of 10 weeks. At the bottom there are the 4 big questions we always ask both teams at the end of what we think is the end of a game. And number 1 is, do you believe you can attain your objectives at this point? And if so, how? And we're very interested in where they think they are, because the objectives that we provide them for the game are very, very specific. And often there's a time frame associated with that. And there's often severe restrictions on the ordnance that they can expend and the losses that they're allowed to take. And there's severe penalties if they violate the loss tolerance factors that we give them. It is not penalty free if you sacrifice your force and you have not won the game. The second question is, what would you have done differently if you could restart? And would you like to go back to that point and restart the game there rather than completely starting the game from scratch? The third one is the most interesting one. From where you are now in the game, and let's say we've completed a 10-week game and we're 21 days into combat, would you switch sides if you could? And we sometimes we have students want to switch sides, and then we entertain that desire, and we'll put them on the other team if they want to do that and they want to continue the game. And finally, do you want to continue playing this scenario? And if both teams say yes, we generally continue it. If one or both teams say no, generally we terminate and we start the game. We start a new game or start that particular game over. You know, I'm trying to emphasize to you that the game itself is a learning process. The game is fluid. The game is dynamic. It doesn't really matter when we start or when we finish. The issue is what's happening during the game, and we take a lot of liberties in maneuvering the game in directions that give us the greatest learning experience and the most operational insights. Now, this is very different, let's say, from the wargaming department, and we often get asked about that. You know, are you the ARPS in wargaming? And no, we're not. That's a totally separate department at the Naval War College. The wargaming department is much bigger than we are. And what they specialize in is putting on games for outside entities. So they'll have a game sponsor, let's say the Pacific Fleet, who will come in and bring a cast of hundreds and say, we want to play a certain scenario that's set in the Western Pacific, and here's the scenario we want to play. Please put this on for us. And the wargaming department will do that for them. So the wargaming department generally has very little control over the parameters of the game. Those are all dictated to them, and what they provide is the expertise on how this is done in order to try and achieve the objectives that command wants. The ARP games are entirely internal, and we have total control over what we do. These are the basic student requirements. It's a rigorous program for our students. As I mentioned earlier, we only take volunteers. We recruit them out of the incoming in-residence classes. They have to be US citizens because they have to be able to get a security clearance. With rare exception, they have to be able to have the top secret clearance. We occasionally take someone who does not if they have a specialty we're looking for. But for the most part, we play at the secret level and we actually analyze at higher classification levels. Each of the students provides active play in at least 3 long games, 10-week games. We have students anywhere from 9 to 15 months, depending upon their program. So some students get 4 games and some very select number of students will get 5 games. Typically, it's 9 hours per week for 2 terms. 2/3 of our group will be elective students, and they comprise our red and blue teams. And then it's 40 hours per week, including about 30 hours of gaming for our control team. And those are our full-time students. So we typically have 1/3 of our group, which is with us full-time in lieu of one of the core courses. And typically they will take the ARP in lieu of the Joint Maritime Operations course, and we in the ARPS have to teach a JPME segment in order to make up for the requirements they would otherwise miss. And our senior students generally take the ARP in lieu of the full-time national security course on the core curriculum side, and they will take a light course to make up those requirements. Our students, in addition to participation in the war games, are required to produce research products, real research products with written reports. So for their elective terms, they have to produce a 15-page research paper relating directly to the issues that we are studying in our ARP. And for their full-time term, it's a 35-page research paper, which is graded under the same criteria they would have on the academic side. I think these have been successful programs. The Halsey Alpha itself has had, as you can see, more than 280 program graduates since program inception in 2003. And we have generated more than 800 research papers, some of them quite good, most of them quite average, but some of them quite good. These are the program deliverables. Number 1 is education, the best joint warfighting education that we can provide. And this takes precedence over everything else that we do, because the most important thing is to get the best program graduates that we can. And we are focused very much on the nuts and bolts of warfighting. So this is not a theoretical course. We don't talk in terms of full spectrum dominance or decisive military operations. We're talking about the parameters of long-range attack systems. We're talking about parameters of the Chinese DF-26, and the students have to know these. They have to memorize an awful lot of system data. But we are preparing officers for true joint theater command. The second deliverable is specific operational recommendations for the operating forces. And each one of the ARPs has a direct conduit into theater command. So for Halsey Alpha, we work quite frequently with Indo-PACOM staff, PAC Fleet staff, and the 7th Fleet staff, and they are avid consumers of our output. And the third one is near-term acquisition recommendations. This is not something we originally had as one of our deliverables, but we do get continuous questions from the Navy staff about where would we recommend putting one additional dollar that might be available? Where's the biggest bang for the buck? And so we actually publish lists of what we think the best near-term investments would be. And we maintain an online site on a classified system in which we publish our findings and publish our recommendations for the benefit of outsiders and acquisition and planning professionals. One thing that's interesting to me is that we did not set out to produce a program which looks like what was done during the heyday of gaming at the War College in the interwar period. But what we do now is very, very reminiscent of the type of iterative gaming that was done in the 1920s and 30s in the development of the Rainbow Plans, and most notably War Plan Orange, the war plan for war with Japan. Back then, the entire student body would be involved in an iterative gaming process. And there's a picture there of the Pringle Hall gaming floor and a bunch of officers who are going through the assessment process. Most of the gaming work back then was done against Japan as the most likely adversary. but an awful lot of the gaming was done against country red, which was Britain, as the pacing, I say the pacing threat, but the pacing entity which represented the highest level of maritime achievement that was in existent in the world. So, we've done the same thing with Halsey Alpha. We're looking at the pacing, for us, China is the pacing threat, and that's why we're looking so heavily at China. A couple of key differences between interwar gaming then and what we do now. Number one is we are fully joint. Back in the 20s and 30s, the Naval War College would do gaming only with naval students. And of course, it didn't really matter back then because the Army and Navy really didn't coordinate with one another. And we're in World War II, essentially each fought their own war with very little contact between them. But today, we cannot think of going into combat without a fully joint force. So it's absolutely critical for us to have a fully joint team. The second key difference is back then, all the students who went to the War College would have this gaming experience. Today, Halsey Alpha only produces 15 graduates a year out of 1,600 some individuals who get a War College diploma. That's about 600 in residence and about 1,000 distance education students. So very, very few officers get any opportunity to do real war gaming outside of the advanced research programs. So between Halsey Alpha, Halsey Bravo, and Holloway, we probably graduate 40 students a year, and those are the ones who get the gaming experience. Finally, I'll end up here with our key areas of study. We can only talk at the unclassified level, but I can give you some general categories of things that have interested us over the past 5 or 6 years. The one that has been with us since the inception of the Halsey Alpha program is countering what used to be called anti-access area denial. In other words, it's an effort by an adversary to build what we now call an anti-Navy, anti-Air Force, reaching out with long-range precision strike weapons in order to blunt our ability to project power at long ranges. And we're very, very interested in the characteristics of that, and particularly the detailed implications of modern missile warfare, what is called long-range precision strike. We live in an era of radical change in the character of warfare driven by these new types of weapon systems in which range is independent of accuracy. And these types of missiles can reach out to virtually unlimited ranges, will hit what they're targeted against, and will be lethal against what they hit. Almost everything in modern warfare centers on targeting and counter-targeting. And that means largely control of the radio frequency spectrum. And I would say we spend the vast majority of our time looking at both control and denial of the radio frequency spectrum. Another key area that we're interested in is alternative basing and maneuver concepts for forces which are increasingly under threat of attack by long-range missile systems. And again, it comes into issues of maneuver, of deception, of trying to either blank out or fool the adversary's surveillance capabilities from both sides, red against blue and blue against red. Along these lines, we look a lot at space and counter space, cyber and counter cyber. I can't say much about cyber and counter cyber because it is one thing which is, I think, defied our quantification over the past few years. We do have nuclear weapons in our games. We look at nuclear deterrence and release thresholds. And I think finally, let me conclude by saying a big effort that we do is to look at wargaming methodologies. How do you best game very, very complex challenges in an environment of very complex warfare? So with that, let me terminate and see what questions and comments that people might have. I thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim. A fascinating presentation. Very thoughtful, and I certainly appreciate the refresher on all the work that the advanced research program students do, and of course the faculty. I had one before I open up the floor. Is what do and I get most of it's classified material that is part of the outcomes, but what does the outcome look like? What can be shared, I guess, with COCOMs or stuff?
We deal at a very, very narrow tactical level. So it's a question of, with the forces that you have, how can you apply them in ways you want to achieve your objectives while under an acceptable level of risk? And so we look an awful lot at how do I maneuver a fleet, a very, let's say, high signature fleet inside a missile umbrella, which has been, cast over the Western Pacific by China or even over the Mediterranean by Russia. And how do you do effective counter targeting? What do you have? What are the tools that you have in order to neutralize the adversary's targeting systems in order to be able to get in and conduct the short range strikes that you want to conduct? And we do this at various levels. So we normally game at the secret level, but we also have top secret recommendations, and we also have higher level recommendations as well. So we are trying to provide them some very, very specific recommendations, which include, things like, what course and speed you should be on in order to notch a high frequency skywave over the horizon radar. And what does this look like in terms of your operations if you are so restricted in maneuver in order to avoid targeting that it inhibits your ability to achieve your objective? These are very nettlesome problems that we're trying to work our way through.
Yeah, no, thank you. The program deliverables were very impressive. Ladies and gentlemen, I now like to open up the floor for questions. As mentioned previously, please submit the questions via the Q&A box. I see there's some in the Q&A box. I also caught one in the chat box, so I'll try to get to those. About 10 minutes or so left for questions. We'll try to get through to them as many as possible. So Jim, the first question from Victor Sussman, and I think you touched on this, is how does the order in which students cycle through red, blue, and control teams influence their approach to the game?
Yeah, it's unfortunately, we don't have a complete control of the accession of students because we would like to put them through probably blue, red, then control. And we actually start some students on the control side, which for an awful lot of students is extremely confusing. I mean, it's sink or swim at that point. It is very important that they see the war from both sides. And I think it is incredibly insightful for them in ways they had never understood before to look at the war from the adversary's side and the adversary's objectives. And I think it makes them very, very cautious. For the most part, students are much more attuned to what the adversary, blue or red, can do to them. And the actual attrition that we see in our games is a lot lower than you might anticipate in a war, simply because they are so attuned to what the adversary can do, and they're looking for critical vulnerabilities. One of the artificialities of our game is, I have to say, I think our practitioners, after they've been with us about 6 to 8 months, are far more attuned to the operational reality of the modern warfight than most practitioners out in the fleet. So to some extent, it's artificial when we have a game output where our players are much more well-informed than, let's say, someone in the fleet might be.
Yeah, interesting. From David Ostrich, and I think David might have had a different idea of the presentation, but I don't want to, speak for him or you, but he asked, you are telling us how you do it rather than what you find out. Do we need this, or is the result more important?
I guess, as I take the comment, the question is, let's say, what would war with China look like? I think that's what people are interested in. And I would say it depends. We always get asked who wins. And the answer is, it depends upon the two things. One, the ingoing assumptions. And some assumptions that we have or outcomes are incredibly sensitive to some key assumptions about the effectiveness or survivability of a given system or platform, which is why we play the games over and over and change those assumptions to do a sensitivity analysis, to see what exactly does the outcome hinge on. The other factor is simply student play. And as I mentioned earlier, we advise students as to the very distinct probabilities of success and of loss for a given operational play, but we allow them to sometimes make very, very risky moves. And so, the output of one game doesn't tell you much. And this is why we do games in series. We very, very seldom write up an individual game output. What we'll do is we'll accumulate often 6 or 8 games and say, these are the insights and lessons that occurred over a series of games on the same scenario. Things that recurred, things that were unusual, recommendations for both the blue and red side that would have enhanced their prospects for success. So that's where we are. And it would be nice if I could give you a presentation, and I gave one today for the commander of the Undersea Warfare Development Command. My colleagues and I did at the classified level, which is very insightful. But in an unclassified environment, I really can't say more about what our findings are, except when people say would the U.S. win or lose in a war over Taiwan, I can say our games show both. It depends. It really depends.
No, understand. From Steve Zepp, how are regional type of conflicts addressed? Scenario of, say, disparate threats from North Korea and Iran occurring simultaneously, and another scenario such as India and Pakistan in direct conflict. What role or roles would the U.S. play?
Yeah, the only third-party scenario we've ever played was 30-part intervention in Korea, in which there's a Korean war that breaks out, and the U.S. and China have a dispute over what the post-war status of North Korea is going to be. That is really the only one in our theater which has a real draw on resources. So you can have other wars breaking out, but the question is there a draw on resources which really impacts your operational play? And quite frankly, if you have a war between the US and China, we're going to have to make a decision on which has priority. And I think most other fights are going to have a much lower priority. Now, we do go back to the actual planning documents. I mean, we have we always start out with the apportionment tables, and the Department of Defense publishes apportionment tables for certain types of scenarios and contingencies. This is what different commanders get, and this is when you get it, and that is our baseline. And so those often take into account a second contingency or a third contingency. But for the most part, it's interesting because the competition for resources generally does not affect the Navy that much. Big competition for resources: Air Force airborne tankers, Air Force airborne ISR. Those are the big ones. Those are the choices that have to be made. But other than, and we do make those choices, but other than that, the Navy pretty much gets what it wants. And so that's another interesting insight from the games that we played.
Right. From Anthony Cowden, you mentioned students being exposed to wargaming at the Naval War College. In academic year 2016 to 2017, there was an effort to expose all students to wargaming. Did that program go away?
Yeah, I think, I hate to speak for the academic side. They do scenario planning exercises, which look kind of like games, but I think for the most part, they still have to keep them unclassified because we have international students who are infused in, let's say, the JMO curriculum. And it's very, very difficult to play any type of a realistic war game, even using unclassified data if you have international students in the group, because you're making assumptions about how things are going to work and not work. So it's a really delicate balance for people on the academic side who I think really want to game, but to come up with a realistic game, which is not classified. And that's just a problem we don't have. Again, we only have US students, although we have often toyed with the idea of what we call the Five Eyes, bringing in Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That would be possible. But even that has hurdles that are hard to get across for us, so we haven't done it.
No, understand. From Victor Sussman again, are there any attributes or characteristics that define successful students in these exercises as more average students?
Yeah, it's very interesting. We do have real superstars that come through there that really delve into the details. I would say, number one, they are self-taught. You bring in officers who know a lot about joint forces and the adversary, and you get maybe one in 10 who just knows everything when they show up, not because they got it from any military course, but because they study this, because they're interested in it, and they dig into this wargaming, with both hands. And sometimes we have to send them home. They'll spend 60 hours a week on our gaming floor working this because they are so invested in it. But they are self-identifying individuals I also, the study effort that I wanted to do, just haven't, is one that postulates that best analysts are inherently pessimistic. And there are actually tests that you can take to determine if you're a pessimist. And I've always wanted to do this, is give our students a test of pessimism when they arrive. And then after 9 to 15 months, see if we consider them to be good analysts. I'm willing to bet there is a correlation there. I am willing to bet there is. And I just wish that I had started doing that 19 years ago.
All right. From Michael Peluche, do you have a Ukraine-Russia scenario or a Baltic equivalent?
I have to defer to the Holloway group. They play Russia, and they have a variety of scenarios that they've played. And yeah, I would have to defer to them to provide any details on what they're doing. They've been around for the past 5 or 6 years, and they've been looking at a whole lot of different Russian scenarios. Very important for us to get that group going. Very timely that we finally got it off the off the dime about the time it became really, really important to have it.
Right. So then perhaps from this one, then from Darren McClurg, I assume you play Taiwanese forces in some scenarios. How about Japan, for example?
Absolutely. Every country that could possibly play in our games, we play. And in fact, Japan has a color. Japan is green, Taiwan is black, Philippines is pink. We, depending upon the scenario, we sometimes will set up a green or black or pink team. We will sometimes recruit ground force expertise, particularly to play Taiwan. And we did that for an entire year. And in fact, took a commercial Taiwan-China war game, adapted it at the classified level, and put a Marine and an Army officer in there playing Taiwan forces in incredible detail. We got an awful lot out of that. I mean, when you're playing, battalion by battalion, moving around on the Taiwan island. Yeah, that was incredibly insightful for us. But every country that could possibly play in this war is in, and no one is left out. So I mean, it's Australia, it's Singapore, Russia plays, on the peripheries. Everyone who has an interest in the outcome is actually simulated in our scenarios.
Good. From Ronald Becker, how are probabilities assigned to variables?
Yeah, it's some of them, in some cases, we know with a great deal of certainty how weapon systems and sensors are going to match up, because we have an awful lot of test data, either tests that we've done on our side or things that we've observed the Chinese do. And some of those are rock solid. Others are just informed speculation. And I have to say, some are just sheer speculation because we don't know. But what we'll do is we will gather together, put our heads together, get the best information we can, assign a probability, play it, and determine, among other things, does that matter? In some cases, probabilities don't really matter to the outcome. In some cases, they are crucial to the outcome. But quite often, we always feed them back to the intel community, saying, this is what we're playing. This is how we played red. What do you think? This is the probability we used. What do you think? But I would have to say that there is, in the US military, there really isn't an established organization that does net assessments. And that's what we're doing, red, blue net assessment. An awful lot of what we do, we have to generate internally simply because the US Department of Defense does not really maintain what I would consider to be a real Office of Net Assessment anymore.
Very good, Jim. I'm sensitive to the time, so we'll stop the Q&A there. Thank you again. It was truly an honor and a privilege to host you this evening and learn a little bit more about the college's advanced research group. We appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule here, particularly a week before graduation now, to spend it with us. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's lecture. Our next presentation won't be until September 21st, which seems a long way away, but time goes fast. We've invited 2 retired captains and authors and graduates of the U.S. Naval War College and entrepreneurs, Captains Anthony Cowden and Jeff Cares, to speak about their co-authored book, Fighting the Fleet, Operational Art in Modern Fleet Combat. They will be joined by Admiral Scott Swift, former commander of the Pacific Fleet, who drafted the foreword to the book. It should be a terrific start to the fall Newport Lecture Series program, and we hope you'll be able to join us. Updates to this presentation and others, including our annual Newport Summer Symposium, which is scheduled for Friday, August 19th. We'll have a number of distinguished guest speakers and panelists who will address China's growing assertiveness and offer their assessments regarding integrated deterrence strategies and challenges and posted on our webpage, the Naval War College Foundation .org/our-events. So any information that we have concerning our events now, you can access on our webpage. Thank you for tuning in tonight and for your continued support for the missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. As always, we seek to expand our membership and raise awareness of the great institution, which is the U.S. Naval War College. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're already a valued Naval War College Foundation member and know others who may like to learn more about the Naval War College and the Foundation, please consider giving them a tax-deductible gift of membership so they too can stay abreast of key issues affecting our national security and democratic way of life. You can contact my staff directly for assistance or simply visit our website and select membership. Thank you again and have a great rest of your evening. Stay safe.